Hello and welcome. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm Editor-in-Chief of RCR Wireless News. Thanks for joining us today on this RCRTV program. Today we'll be talking about network virtualization, talking a little bit more about NFV and SDN, some of the new acronyms hitting the market nowadays. Joining me today, as you can see, is Peter Jarich, who's VP of Consumer and Infrastructure Services at Current Analysis. Thanks, Peter, for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
And also joining us is Neela Jacques, or Nicholas Jacques, who's the Executive Director at the OpenDaylight Project, which is a kind of I guess, a trade organization kind of covering the SDN and NFV virtualization space. And we'll get some more information from Neela on that as well later. But thanks for joining us today, Neela. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan.
Great. Well, this topic that we're going to be covering, us at RCR Wireless recently did a report on this that you can see on our website on rcrwireless.com that we released a couple weeks ago. And also we had a webinar 2 weeks ago on the topic as well. So I won't go over too much of the report. You can obviously download it from our website. And if you check out our webinar, that's still on demand on our website. You can check it out there. But basically what we did was we looked at kind of the virtualization space that's kind of getting a lot of traction. I know carriers are becoming more and more interested in perhaps cutting expenses and using virtualization to sort of speed up the deployment of services on their network. So our report kind of looked at some of the topics there, some of the challenges going on in the space right now, kind of where we are at today with virtualization, I guess the market potential for virtualization. Obviously, I think Peter and Neela will talk a little bit about that as well as we go on here. But I did want to say, I know we got some information from Infinetics, which is a research firm out there. I mentioned that that the SDN part, at least, is a $3 billion market potential going forward. So obviously, it's a big market. From talking with the companies involved in our report, it seems like it's a market that it's at least on the SDN side, it's there now, perhaps slowly coming to market. NFV seems to be a little bit farther out, maybe another year or so. But again, I think Peter and Neela will provide some more insight on that than what I have. But that's kind of what we looked at in our report. And like I said, it's available on our website at rcrwireless.com, where you can download it and check out some of the insight there. But with that, I did want to kind of bring in our speakers to get some more expert analysis on this topic. So first, I wanted to bring on Peter Jarich here. Like I said, he's with Current Analysis. So maybe I guess start off, Peter. I guess getting a look from you at network virtualization and kind of I guess its importance to the telecom space from your point of view.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. You bring up some good points about where you see SDN versus NFV, sort of SDN versus virtualization, and where people are moving first. And I think it's interesting because that's almost exactly the same thing we found in our survey work, right? If you look at the time frames, right, it seems like there was discussion of people, they wanted to move on SDN, maybe let's say, near term through medium term. NFV was a little bit longer out. Some people just saying they weren't interested at all. But it's funny because if you compare that to, I think, what we saw at Mobile World Congress, that it seems like the buzz this year was at least much more squarely focused on NFV and virtualization than it was on SDN. And I don't know if that's in part because we're sort of understanding it more. I mean, if you look last year, everything was SDN, right? It may have been SDN, although people meant NFV, right? They may have meant virtualization, and we're just sort of grouping it all under SDN. But this year, everyone announced some sort of virtual packet core, right? Virtual EPC. Almost every single vendor announced something. If they hadn't, they announced trials before the show, right? And we had customers commenting that it wasn't just the people you knew were going to do that, but smaller players that somehow felt they needed to be in the space, and you might not expect them with a virtual EPC. Beyond that, I think that we saw virtualization much more focused, I think, in the RAN than expected. How do we virtualize base stations as well as the stuff that I think we've been talking about before? So it seems like we're moving forward, but it also seems like, where we're seeing this is also operators trying to figure out what makes sense to virtualize and when, right? You saw a number of announcements out of Mobile World Congress that were vendors working with operators to figure out how do we virtualize certain parts of the network, when do we virtualize those, what's the right timing around that. And I think it really points to the idea that, to your question of how important is it, that operators know that this is key to really helping them to run their networks more efficiently and deploy their networks more efficiently, and a little bit on the side then of how they roll out services quicker. But I'm sure we can get into a lot of that as we go on.
Yeah, sure, and that's a good point. I mean, obviously, yeah, coming from Mobile World Congress, the news coming out of it, like you said, was very heavy on the virtualization space, and again, like you said, it was a lot of NFV stuff as opposed to SDN. But yeah, it did seem like that was if you weren't announcing something related to virtualization, you're almost being left behind. It seemed at this point, and like you said too, it did seem like the virtualization aspect is becoming more entrenched in the network, or at least there's more opportunities for virtualization. I guess, are you seeing this being driven from carrier demand, or is this still a push from the vendor community right now, from your point of view, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always that question, right? Is it operator vendor driven? I think that question has sort of gone away to the extent that we've seen operators really pushing this, right? We saw the operators get together, whether through any number of bodies, to really make their demands known, right? And NFV coming out and you know, being a focus from operators of what they want to do. And it's interesting because I think we had a couple of conversations with operators that really bring this to light. One was, with and there seems to be a handful of operators out there that I think we all know are the innovators, right? They're the ones who are testing and trialing this stuff out early. And talking with one of them just last week at Mobile World Congress, they made the point that, look, we've ceded too much control of our network over to our vendors, historically. And we need to pull some of that back. And think about it, virtualization, if we can move this stuff onto commercial hardware, if we can get software from a number of different suppliers, heck, if we can even roll out our own software. I mean, they were essentially talking about rolling their own EPC software. Well, then they can pull some of that back and take control of that. So, I mean, beyond the fact that we know operators are trying to figure out how do they get more efficient, how do they simplify their networks, this idea of pulling some control back, I think really goes to point that this isn't just something that's being driven by vendors, that there is a real operator need out there.
Interesting.
Dan, I think this is an interesting point. I'd love to actually jump in on that.
Please do.
I know you're going to come to me on some other stuff, but it's funny when I think about is something vendor-driven or is it being driven by an end user? I think one of the first questions is where naturally do the benefits of the technology flow to? And if you look on the SDN side, it's really been pushed by academics and it's been pushed by startups who see a chance in many ways to disrupt the way that the network is. And then what you've seen is you've had a lot of the existing vendors trying to figure out a way, seeing this trend in SDN and saying, how do I make sure I'm relevant? Right? How do I make sure that I show that, hey, this sounds great, we've been doing some of it already, here's why you should continue to buy what I'm doing, and so you've got this element of moving in. But on the SDN side, absolutely, you've had a huge discussion around the vendors because this is a highly disruptive technology on the vendor side, but there's immediate profit. There's an immediate profit motive, especially for the smaller guys. If I look at the NFV side, almost all of the benefits flow to the end user immediately. And it's a lot more challenging to see who is going to make more money if NFV happens. I think from an end user side, you look at what's driving NFV. Unlike server virtualization, which is primarily driven by a desire to have server consolidation to begin with, from what I've seen on the NFV side, it's been around being able to have more agile networks. I have heard, and Peter, I think you were alluding to this, I have heard a lot of carriers say to me, it used to be that we could take 3 years, a year to plan, to roll out something new, a year to plan what we had, a year to test, and then you put it out. That you do that, and a year and a half into it, your competitor has already rolled it out. And so there is that desire to say, how can I be more agile in my network? And I need to abstract. I need to be able to abstract my network services because waiting to buy for my next cycle to buy another box to roll out my service just is too slow. So what I've seen on the NFV side is the carriers getting together as part of ETSI saying, we absolutely need this, and then coming back 6 months later, a year later saying, wait guys, you're not moving fast enough. We want this right now. And on the vendor side, some vendors looking at themselves going, wait a second, are you willing to pay as much for a VM as you are for a piece of tin? And so potentially I've heard carriers who say, I'm wondering, are people dragging their feet? I don't necessarily think it's dragging their feet, but I think vendors have to think about and have to work out, how am I going to make as much money or more money on the NFV side? There's some different dynamics between the two markets that I see at least. Peter, have you seen similar things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, and it's interesting in terms of the agility side of things. We definitely seen. I mean, if you look at some of the demos, right, and you look at sort of where we see some of the virtualization focus being, clearly EPC was one. But you look at service chaining, right? Service chaining perhaps tied to something like virtual CPE. I mean, that goes exactly to your point of how do we roll some of this I think service chain is neat because it really pulls in those, let's say, the dynamics between SDN and NFV. And I think we've seen a lot of confusion out there, right? Are they separate? You need to do them together. How do they come together? But I think it really does point to the agility. But I think more to the point of what you hit is, it really comes to this: how do we price this stuff, right? Because I think where the vendors are is they know that so I'll go back. Interesting conversation I had a couple of years ago with a big EPC vendor. They said, look, we've got this great product, customers love it, but they say, we need you to move this on to data center hardware. We need you to virtualize this. And the response I got back was, we know this is an opportunity. We know we need to do this because if we don't, someone else will. But we're making margins like this right now, and do those margins become like that? And how do we handle that? Yeah. Right? So there they have to figure that out. But at the same time, they've got to figure out, how do we make this stuff quote unquote carrier grade? Right? I mean, how do we make sure that we're rolling this out with some level of quality that we can stand behind, or do we just sort of have two worlds? Do we have, okay, keep your traffic on your normal hardware that you've had out there running for a while, do new stuff on this other on these other virtualized platforms, and maybe certain types of applications that you're not too worried about on the new stuff. And I think all those things are getting figured out right now.
That's right.
We're learning a lot about this, and you think about this, right? You think about the EPC side of stuff. You look at Cisco. Cisco, if you go back, they've talked about, they did announcements years back about how they actually had ported some of their EPC onto x86 platforms, right? They did it for the RNC and the DNC, back years ago, right? It was kind of quiet, right? But they were doing that. You look at someone like NSN, who has put their EPC on ATCA platforms, kind of a form of virtualization, right? Software really being the focus there, not so much the hardware. And yet we're still trying to figure out how we get the stuff buttoned up to be reliable enough for operators. So it's a long process, and that's I think that contributes to what looks like foot dragging.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, well, and actually, before we get going too much further, I probably should have brought Neela on earlier. But Neela, if you want to maybe, I guess, get some background on the OpenDaylight project too, just so people who might have not quite know what the organization is, maybe just a little background on the organization.
Sure. Happy to. So first of all, the OpenDaylight project is an open source project in the network industry. It's focused on SDN and NFV. And it's actually something quite new in a sense to the world. I don't know how familiar everybody is with what's been going on with open source, but there's been a pretty big shift over the last, say, 15, 20 years, where it used to be that you had proprietary over here, and you had these crazy guys over there that just wanted to give it all away for free and just thought that you shouldn't pay for software. And we sort of saw those wars in the press, and you got all these sort of funny quotes from the Bill Gates of the world going, open source is a cancer, and these intellectual battles. Well, something really interesting has kind of crept up over the last 15, 20 years, which is what instead the industry has figured out is open source. There is a different model, and I call it the open plus model, or the open source plus model, where what you figured out is that there is a hybrid model that works better than each of the extreme models. That what actually makes sense a lot is, rather than have all of these separate silos of proprietary software, or even full open source silos, what makes sense to have is have a set of common substrate or primitives that can be shared and collaborated on by an entire industry, and then you can have solutions that are built on top. So if you look at things like Hadoop, it's a great example in the database world, or in the big data world, where you've got Cloudera, you've got MapR, you've got Hortonworks, where all three profit-making companies, but they're all built and investing in one open source core. If you look at networking, what's interesting is, while there's tremendous amount of open source in networking, it's primarily in these very sort of small projects, these small bit technologies. But for the most part, networking hasn't really advanced in terms of open source. And so if we look at SDN actually offered a great opportunity to do that in a world in which the intelligence primarily lived on each of the boxes. It didn't really matter that you had 5 boxes from 5 different vendors that didn't work that well together. As long as they spoke a standard protocol, for example, that was fine. Now, in SDN, a big part of our objective is to be able to centralize intelligence, to be able to have truly programmable networks. And so what you found is every vendor got into SDN. Everybody wanted to do it, and one of the first things is, well, I've got to build this controller. And so guess what we have? You've got 30 to 40 controllers out there in the world. And what has that created? You've got this really interesting case where you've got end users out there, whether they be carriers or people who run data centers, who say, we really want SDN. I need programmable networks. I need the ability to, on the fly, shift the routing of traffic. They go out, they do an evaluation, and now I have to do 30 POCs. Well, that gets daunting, that gets really expensive, and so people have been doing only a little bit on the side, and SDN adoption has been slower than you'd look. So what the OpenDaylight Project is bringing all the different folks in the industry together to work on a common platform, initially built around a common controller platform. And what you're seeing is that's being taken in a couple different directions. You've got some folks who are going to build distros, like you're familiar with Red Hat, for example, Enterprise Linux. You can have distros of OpenDaylight. You also have folks creating the products on top of it. So you've got already products that have come out from Cisco, from IBM, and you're going to see some others. And so it's a really interesting project. We view SDN and NFV very much connected once you have that control. You know, you talked about service chaining, for example. It makes a lot of sense to be able to have these different services plug right in to a common controller platform. And so we're investing a lot in that, and working, again, both with the carrier community as well as the data center community on that.
Got it. Perfect. That sounds good. Well, I guess maybe taking a step back too is maybe for those who don't quite understand maybe the difference between SDN and NFV. I know in the report we did, we spent some time trying to explain that part of it because, again, it does seem like maybe it is not necessarily new, but it is kind of a new acronym for everybody. Maybe I guess, you know, from Neela, maybe I guess your view, if you could just maybe like in a minute quickly kind of what's the difference between SDN and NFV and how do they play together?
Sure, absolutely. So the simplest way I will put it is SDN is really about the control plane. It's about taking intelligence and moving it out of the underlying boxes, or at least some of the intelligence, into one place, into one central place. So if you think about an army, for example, you could have a bunch of soldiers running around trying to talk to each other about trying to figure out who to attack and how to attack, or you can have some level of someone at the top telling the army what to do. Now, you've got different models of that, right? One model is a typical one guy, 50,000 people underneath, and that's great for a full frontal. Or you can have the special forces model, where you've got a set of groups that go out and do their mission, and every 2 weeks check in. And there's a huge debate in the industry around which way. But SDN, at its heart, regardless who you listen to, has some level of the separation of the control plane and the data plane.
Got it.
All right. As we look at network functions virtualization, this is a related but very different market. Network functions virtualization is around, as we look at adding functions in the network, regardless of what they were, typically it was about adding another pizza box. And so the way I think about it is these more data plane functions being able to have a model in which, by virtue of moving those from a box to a virtual machine, to begin with, I have an ability to simply scale them out, to put them out, to change where they go. By being able to virtualize the underlying network functions, I now gain a set of capabilities which I didn't have before. And that has a wide range of advantages. A big one, obviously, is the ability to have not only greater programmability that we get from SDN, but also greater automation on the network side. As well as being able to create and offer different services and spin them up much, much faster than you could before.
Got it. Okay, that sounds good. I appreciate that. It definitely helps out too. Now, I know kind of before, kind of a little sidetrack there, but maybe I guess, and Peter, I guess the timing aspect of this. Now, obviously, like you said, this year at Mobile World Congress, it was a lot of NFV talk. In the past, it was more SDN talk. It does seem like SDN is perhaps a little more along the progression scale. I guess when you see timing on this, what's your kind of view on one? I guess broader adoption of SDN, and perhaps then the next step is the broader adoption of NFV by carriers.
Yeah, I mean, so going back to the idea of where those things are sort of in their adoption cycle, or where operators are thinking about them. I mean, we've got to remember that NFV as a topic, or as a word, as a term, really just came out in, what was it, September 2012, right? I mean, so it was, it really has been around sort of for, I don't want to say less time. I mean, the idea of virtualization has been around, but NFV as a term. I mean, in terms of how it's going to get rolled out, clearly it's going to depend on every operator. I mean, we're going to see some moves Obviously, there are NFV trials that have been going on, and POCs through last year. I think we've got folks talking about up through the end of this year into early 2015. We're going to see some stuff. I think the question is really, particularly on virtualization, it really depends on what type of applications and how far we're going, right? So we're going to start with things like maybe EPC, IMS, ultimately moving into things like RAN. How do we time those? I mean, that's obviously going to be progression. On the SDN side of things, I think there's also sort of different ways of thinking about that. We talked about the definition of what SDN is, but you can look at it in multiple different ways in terms of there's transport SDN, where we've got the optical guys really getting into it, which may be a little bit more simple in some ways, versus let's say SDN in support of NFV, right? How do we get the resources out to those applications? How do we get the resources out to those functions as we spin them up or spin them down? So I think, obviously we're seeing the moves right now. We're seeing the trials and whatnot, but really for broader adoption, I don't think anyone's thinking really until next year that we're going to start seeing that stuff sort of becoming more commonplace. And I think the one last thing just to think about is, if we want to think about the move towards virtualization, the move towards SDN, splitting out the control data planes, as the next way of re-architecting the network. I think that's what a lot of people do, right? It's the next IP or TDM to IP transition. I think we have to remember that the TDM to IP transition, we're still in the middle of it, right? And we were talking about that 10, 15 years ago, and it's still ongoing. So this is going to be one of those things that we're going to be talking about 10 years of, how far are we along with this stuff? How far are we towards virtualizing everything? So it's going to take a long time. So even if we do start seeing more real movement in 2015, that's still pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, it does seem like a process that, like you said, there's no end date. I mean, obviously, to say there's a timeline shouldn't be the right way to put it, because it's one of those things where it seems like carriers are looking to virtualize more and more. So it's just kind of if it makes sense, we can virtualize it. If not, we don't do it. So it does seem like it's not a set process. If it makes sense, we do it. It's not necessarily.
Well, and the question of where it makes sense, I think, will change, right? Yeah. Again, there were a lot of discussions around, let's say, virtual RAN, and the idea of sticking your base station baseband on just a commercial off-the-shelf server would have been crazy talk a couple of years ago, right? Yeah. And so as we get to the point where maybe that makes sense, I think we will see that line move towards, well, it didn't make sense last year, now maybe it does make sense next year. I think sort of what was telling, and it'd be interesting to get everyone else's sort of idea on this, is that there was a lot of talk, let's say, Mobile World Congress about 5G, right? What is 5G? 5G is coming, blah, blah, blah. But I think what was interesting is that a big part of that discussion was this idea that virtualization of various parts of the network is going to be part and parcel of 5G. And I think that's sort of telling them, one, how important it is to operators and how they're thinking about it going forward, but two, sort of the time frame on this, right? If 5G is really a 2020 sort of thing, the idea is that virtualization is sort of being assumed to be part of it is good because it's important, but it also puts some context in the timing.
Yeah, interesting.
Sure. I was going to jump in on that. I think that you're right in terms of your timing. I think the one thing that I want to capture, though, is in many of these markets, what you find is this is not a linear growth. You end up getting, it's going to come, is it hype, is it? And then it takes off, and it was obvious to everybody. And we've seen that over and over again. And, I'm dating myself here, but I remember very well when we went from cassette tapes to CDs, right? And, everybody knew, in a sense, everybody was talking about CDs, but none of us had CDs. We had these, crazy yellow Sony Walkmans going around. And there's probably a better, more recent example that I can give, but it's the one that came to mind, right? And then there got to be a point, right, when you walk in, you're looking around and everything's pointing to the CD has come. You walk into the record store. You remember those things? Tower Records or something like that. You walk into Tower Records and suddenly it used to be you could only see one little shelf of CDs. Suddenly half the store is CDs. And suddenly the cost of the CD player has come down. And so you end up getting an entire ecosystem that moves kind of all at once. Now, there's certainly the possibility that doesn't happen. I mean, Blu-ray never seemed to catch on. But I think if you look at, and my view is, with NFV, even more so than SDN, that you've got a little bit of this network effect going on. And it's quite difficult in the early days. If you're one of the early bleeding edge vendors, you've got the challenge that if you want to deliver something as a virtual machine, for example, as a virtualized network function, you still have to be able to offer it in your old form factor. And you've got to support both, and you've got to test both, and that adds a lot of cost. And so from an ROI analysis, there's always a good reason to say, maybe I'll wait another 6 months, or I'll do it in a limited side, or only in a part of it. When this becomes the dominant way, when people have bought the servers that'll support, like you were saying, the line speed that you're looking for, when they're the diagnosis tool, then it becomes a no-brainer, and you say, hey, I'm just going to deliver some or all of what I do, and when the business model is proven. So I think we're figuring out all of those things, like you said, Peter, but I expect that you will see at some point where you're going to get this rapid sort of flipping of the market, and that might happen at the end of this year, that might happen next year. It's a little bit hard to predict, but I think it is coming.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part about that is, we had some conversations, obviously, over the last week. One of the big moves was, AT&T moving forward, sort of on what had been known as Domain 2.0. And just talking with some of the vendors out there, they were saying it was interesting to see, just following that, how there were other RFPs or there were other investigations that kicked it off, right? And you know how that works, right? Some operators going, oh crap, those guys did that. What's our plan? What are we doing? Or we better get those conversations going. And I think those are the kind of things that build that sort of tipping point of, you get to sort of a critical mass. One or two guys kick it off, of course, there's other people to go.
That's right.
And the rest of the world is doing this. We better have a plan, and let's go in that direction. Particularly if that then, from a scale perspective, impacts how things are priced. Vendors are just not going to be interested to sell, that old kit. And maybe if we think about record stores, I don't know. Vinyl's cool, so maybe someday, the old way of selling products, people will have collector's items, or you go to the store, and the real aficionados buy the dedicated proprietary hardware.
Well, and you totally saw that. It's interesting. You talked about AT&T. John Donovan was at Mobile World Congress. He's also here in Santa Clara, where I've been spending the last couple days at Open Network Summit. And he gave a keynote not too different from the one he gave at Mobile World Congress. But one of the interesting things is he gave it right after NTT gave theirs. And in both cases, this was not an if. It really even wasn't a when. It was, we are doing this, and we're doing it right now. And the NTT one was very, very detailed and down in, I'm not going to say the weeds, but in the details of how they're doing it. I think John Donovan was a little higher level. And one of the interesting things that he said, and I think he did this very consciously, he talked about how they weren't just going to look at the existing large vendors, and he called out some small vendors, and the one that jumps to mind is TLS System, a small company out of Sweden that has built some really, really neat NFV functionality based on Yang tools. They've been one of the big proponents of Yang tools, and it's interesting. You get John Donovan from AT&T standing in front of the 1,600 people in the industry, and who does he choose to talk about? Not Cisco, not Juniper, not Ericsson, although he did mention some of the large vendors, but he spent a good 5-10 minutes talking about TLF and why AT&T's working with them. And I think that is a shot across the bow of everybody there saying, we're going to move, and either you're with us or we're going to leave you behind, because we are willing as a carrier to make some real trade-offs, to make some real investment. We know it's harder to work with smaller vendors, but where the technology enables us to be more agile, we're gonna do that.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. Everyone had their bets and their thoughts about who the vendors would be that got named. I think it wasn't too surprising to see a vendor like Ericsson, a big sort of SI.
Sure.
They're not just an SI, but they do a lot of systems integration. But I think it was telling / surprising there wasn't a big IT guy like an Oracle or an IBM, but you did the smaller folks, right? And think about something like a firm, right? How many people, unless you are really deep in the packet core, how many people have really heard of a firm? That's great. They're doing great things. They've been focused on the packet core. They've been focused on virtualization. And I think that is telling. I think it's the same thing. There really is a message that was being sent more than anything from AT&T. And who knows, 5, even 2 or 3 years from now, what role those guys will play on the network. But the fact that they were part of that first announcement, I think that was the message.
Yeah.
Well,
The other point. Sorry, Dan. I just want to add one more thing, which is the other interesting thing that I was hearing a lot about. I was not at Mobile World Congress, so Peter, I'd love to hear if this was a theme there too. But at Open Network Summit, it was amazing how often open came up as a topic. It was mentioned by every single speaker, and not as, oh, in general we want open, but almost everybody was talking about open standards. There were obviously lots of discussions around open flow, but also open source. And again, AT&T came in and said, we are investing in open source. We think that open source is a major part of getting what we want. And so they're recognizing that the model is changing, and that the way the world used to be, with all these silos competing, saying, all these proprietary vendors saying, my way's better, no, my way's better, no, you're stupid, no, you're stupid, that this just isn't working for the carriers. And that open source is a new model that they want to participate in. Now, there are a lot of questions in the Q&A that came up around how exactly do you do that. They've got these big procurement teams that know how to deal with a vendor. They haven't yet built these open source teams that can evaluate some of the code. Do they evaluate in its raw form? Do they wait till someone picks it up? And I've had lots of conversations around the carriers that they're trying to figure that out for themselves, and how do they fund it? Because procurement knows, I know how to say I need to build out 4G, and I'm going to put $4 billion towards this element, and I know how many boxes, and I'm going to do an RFP and deal with that. It's a little bit harder. These smaller research arms don't necessarily have the money and the funds to hire developers to invest in open source projects, and they're trying to figure that out right now.
I mean, it's more than that. I mean, so you talk about the procurement teams, right? Think about, and going back to, we did some survey work, and it was really interesting to see that when we talk with operators about how they're making their decisions, like high on their list of what is important to them, pricing, right? And this stuff is, obviously pricing is always important, but it's rarely called out, right? Operators are, they want to wave their hand, go, no, I'm willing to pay more to get the best solution, but no. When we talk with them recently, they're like, no, we think pricing is important. Well, think about that open idea versus pricing. And again, open was huge.
Yeah.
Last year was really the open discussion around devices. Hey, we want open OSs, we want Firefox, we want Ubuntu, we want all the stuff that's open. This year was really on the network side. Everyone was definitely talking about that. But think about what a procurement team does when they're working with, let's say, an end-to-end solution from one vendor versus something that's open that has a whole lot of folks in it, right? You can hide some of the costs or shift costs or end up with something a little bit more easily when you're talking about one vendor versus something that's open and has 4 or 5, right? 4 or 5 different vendors, they all each need their money out of it, you're trying to pull them together. I think this whole idea of open, whether it's how you test things, whether it's how you price things, it really is a challenge for the vendors, and it's a challenge for the operators, and I think it's definitely something that everyone's talking about. I don't know if it's sort of paying lip service right now, because I think getting something that works from an end-to-end solution perspective seems to be a bigger concern, but it's at least good to see people paying lip service to it.
But this is an interesting difference between, as I compare across industries, if you look at the financial services industry versus the telecom industry. On the financial services industry, they hire thousands and thousands of developers. Right? You've seen actually a lot of software companies that come out and they're spun out. I think Dynamic Ops, for example, was spun out of Credit Suisse. In the old days, you used to see that with Bell Labs, right, on the telco side. But there's been such a squeeze on the margin side that they've really had to cut everything that felt non-core and go to more of a marginal cost business of, okay, I'm going to be able to charge, I'm going to add something that's going to go from a bill of $80 to $100 to $120 to be able to support that. I'm going to do an ROI model where I'm going to buy 6,000 boxes at $50,000 a piece from X vendor, right? They've been controlling their costs in that way. But now what's interesting is there's suddenly a lot more profit that can be made because we've got all these devices connecting into the network. And I think one of the most interesting questions to me is, does the telecom industry change and become more like the financial services industry, where they differentiate by actually building elements of their infrastructure, by coming out with interesting new services and getting more share of wallet from the customers? Or do they slide down the other side and become really much more of a utility, a low-margin utility that we all know the business, we all know it's going to spit out X amount of cash, and it's about just squeezing down the investment and having a inflation plus a little bit price bump every year.
But we also know they don't want to do that, right? I mean, we also know that time and again the operators are challenged with challenged with competing against the OTTs, and you can't be a dumb pipe. I think it's interesting because as much as people might think it's crazy when I talk to an operator and the operator says, "Hey, we might spin our own EPC, right? Hey, this would be something that we think about doing." You go, "Well, that's crazy. Like, why would you do that? I mean, is that a good use of your resources?" I think to your point, like going forward, particularly as we get to open, if the base of what's taking place with that EPC software is out there and affordable, then if you can build on top of that, right, then we might have some new models, right? And you look at, again, going back to that discussion to begin with, where we saw smaller vendors rolling out their own virtual EPC solutions. I think we don't know exactly how that was done, but I think we all pretty much know that those smaller vendors went to someone who had some stacks. They bought some stacks from that vendor, maybe did some of their own stuff, and then they did that. But it's not that hard, right? I mean, we were joking that if I wanted to roll out the Peter Jarich virtual EPC, I could probably do it, right? I just have to go to one or two vendors, and we know who they are, right? I go to a Radisys, I go to an Aerosint, I go whoever, and get some software and spin out my own EPC. Would I do that?
Right.
Well, probably not. But I mean, if an operator wants to do that, the base is there, and if you can differentiate on top of that, then that would be great. I think a lot of them will be too afraid to do that, and I think that's why you're probably going to see some operators who take the lead and maybe they sell that to other operators, and it becomes, there's a handful of operators that maybe are innovating and the rest are making that sort of dumb pipe money. I don't know, but it's neat that that's an option out there.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, obviously, and like I mean, operators are a bit averse to change. I think we've all seen that. So something that's happening this quickly is probably catching them a bit off guard. And like you said, they're probably struggling a little bit to realize what's happening. Obviously, they want to see the financial aspect of it. That's going to be a big part of it. I know, Peter, you mentioned that they don't want to say that price is a big concern, but obviously that's always a big concern. I mean, that's like you said, they're not going to ever say it up front. But if they are saying it on this, that must be pretty important because that's behind the scenes, that's always a big concern for those guys to make sure that they can make money.
And that's exactly the way we look at it. We know it's always a concern, but they rarely say it. So when they're saying it, it must be a super big concern. And you get it, right? This is new, right? The ROI isn't completely well understood. I think that's one of the big questions of, like anything new. What's the ROI? Is it built on saving money? Is it built on making new money? And so when I have a sort of uncertain ROI, then I want to make sure that at least the costs are kept in check so that I'm not losing a lot of money on this.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, obviously, it's a topic that we can talk for a long time on. Maybe before we wrap this up, maybe get, I guess, a final word from you guys. Just kind of looking forward on this topic here. Maybe from Neela, I guess your general view, maybe like a year from now, we're having this discussion again. What do you think is different a year from now when it comes to NFV and SDN? Do you think it's a different topic? Are we more evolved? What do you think we are a year from now on this topic?
That's a great question. Look, let me start by sort of the world that I live in, and then I'll go a little broader. I think that what you're seeing is, at least on the OpenDaylight side, for the first time ever, we now have all of the major vendors cooperating together on a common platform. And you probably know, viewers probably know, that the Hydrogen release, which is the first release of OpenDaylight, just came out. And a lot of people really thought that this was impossible. You could never get Cisco and Ericsson and IBM and Citrix and Brocade and all of the others, and small vendors like Radware, all working together and actually getting something out. I think that right now, in 2014, end users have the ability to download this, play with it, look in. We're already seeing the carriers do that. And so I think that what you will start seeing by the end of the year is people going, whoa, open source in the networking industry is a real technology that can have a big impact. Maybe it's around agility, maybe it's around cost, but we'll see it and then be ready to invest more in it. And then I think the big question, I think the debate that we'll be having next year is how do you consume open source, not whether you consume open source. Meaning, do I want to consume it? Is this simply a primitive that is used by large vendors to create kind of, it'd be a tweak on the old model. I still buy a solution from a vendor, but where I used to look for a standard, now I look that 50% of it is open source code, so that I'm not locked in to any one vendor. Or do I actually want to consume things that are 90%, 95%? Do I want to look for distros? I think that I'm hoping that's a debate that we're going to have, and I think that's the debate that we're going to have. I think more broadly, the shift that is happening around SDN and NFV, we have no idea the impact that it's going to have. In the same way as, when you told me about a cell phone the first day, I thought this is great. Business people are going to be able to talk to their clients, out of their car. And today, what do I use my cell phone for? Well, 5 years ago, it was for asking my wife if she picked up the tortillas from one side of the grocery store to the other, a use case I never would have thought of. Today, my phone is actually an internet access device, far, far more than a voice communications device, right? And again, you wouldn't guess. I think that when we've abstracted all of the elements of the network, when we've been able to have a centralized area, we are going to bring the cost of running a network, the potential to be able to spread a network in ways we haven't thought. And I'll give one last sort of fun example of something that blew my mind and might blow yours. You think about dead zones. And you think about a dead zone as a dead zone. It's there, right? You've got a tower, and it can only broadcast a certain amount. Turns out you can turn up the power on that tower, and it can actually change the radius of how far it goes out. And so if you have a high-value client sitting right between two towers, sitting at the edge, and therefore potentially in a dead zone or in an area, a carrier can actually boost the power here, lower the power there, and actually shift the coverage and take that high-value customer and put him in the center of the coverage area rather than at the edge. So, and this can be done dynamically. We can detect, this is technology that exists today. And so suddenly you can go in and say, hey, you want to pay $100 a month or $150 a month? You're going to get great coverage wherever you are. Never a drop call, perfect quality. You know what? You don't have a lot of money, $20 a month. We're going to make a best effort, but sometimes it's going to be spotty and it goes down, but that's okay because you don't have a lot of money. That's an example of the kind of things that are going to be possible, but all of that is predicated on an OSS system that can handle that billing. It's predicated on a whole set of system and service chaining that's able to quickly fire off, built on intelligence, a set of actions that alters the network. And I think that we're going to see many, many more uses like that. We're going to enable things like the Internet of Things and the Internet of Everything, as suddenly many things that we never thought benefiting from data are going to be spitting out data, and we're going to have automation on top of it.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, like you said, it's not going to be just a hardware world anymore. It's going to be definitely more software, fine-tuning the hardware authority methods. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Well, maybe Peter, I guess your final view on maybe what we'll be looking at here coming up in the next 12 months or so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I follow up the discussion with CEM and virtualization and Internet of Things. That's wow. I think it's like optimization 101. Anyways, no, I mean, I think so. I think just going off of some of those points, I think that there's two sets of dynamics that I think we need to think about going into the next year. It's sort of the technical side of things and the business side of things. And look how far the technical side of things has come over the last year, right? We went from this idea that people really didn't have this SDN versus NFV understanding very well. It was sort of all grouped together in one sort of big homogeneous telco IT move. A year later, I think we understand the value props of each of those, and we're moving forward on proof of concepts, right? I mean, that's a long way to come in a year. So where are we going to be next year? I think we're going to have a lot of that. The proof of concepts, we'll go from proof of concepts to more trials or commercial deployments in a couple of cases. The technical side of things won't be as big of a deal. We can start getting over to the business side of things, right? What is we talk about some of these new business models, right? How do we pull CEM into discussion? I think the interesting part, though, is there will still be new technical problems to solve, right? And each of those dynamics are going to continue to move. There'll be new business problems to solve, new technical issues to solve. I think the question of, how do we orchestrate a lot of this stuff so we have some level of service assurance? That was one of the big themes from Mobile World Congress, orchestration, right? Yeah. So, hey, open's great, but how do we orchestrate across all these? And do we end up having, in the same way we talked about, multiple gateways? And are there gateways upon gateways in terms of hierarchical nature? Are we going to have orchestrators and orchestrators of orchestrators? And I think those things are a business discussion as well as a technical discussion to make some of this real. But I think we're going to be a lot farther along with the technical side of things. I think the business discussions of how we roll some of this stuff out will be, will be really the next frontier. And that really gets into the OSS, BSS side of things. I mean, I think, to the example I give Amdocs a lot of credit because they do a really good job, particularly when they went out and they bought Actix, telling the story of, hey, we understand the network, right? We can understand optimization. We can understand what's going on in the network. If we can tie that together with OSS, BSS, we can come up with those sort of models of, hey, here's a high-value customer. Can we optimize the network in real time, not just based around network parameters, but customer parameters? That's a great, that's a great model, and it's the kind of thing that you're going to hear from someone who has OSS, BSS assets. but there's going to be technical considerations of how we make that happen, and then the business considerations of do we want to make that happen, how do we monetize that. So I think we're going to see those both move further along. I hope next year's the year we start having more of those business conversations.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. The business side of things is going to be not a make or break part of it, but obviously it's going to be something that has to get worked out for carriers and for the industry to really get behind it. It's going to make sure the financial parts. I mean, obviously the technical part, that stuff will always get worked out at some point. I mean, there's smart enough people working on this. That part will get worked out. It's the business side of things where hopefully things will get tripped up and we lose some momentum here. But it does seem like obviously there's so much potential with this that again, as long as the pieces fall in place, it should be a good, interesting next year, that's for sure. So. Well, again, guys, definitely appreciate the insight today. For those of you who are watching this, if you want to get some more information on this topic, I definitely recommend you check out the OpenDaylight Project. A great website to get some great information on there, some good white papers on there as well. And also Peter Jarich, he's over at Current Analysis, so go to currentanalysis.com. Peter's got some great insight there for a lot of network stuff too. So definitely check out those sites. And also, like I said, beginning of this too, on the RCRWireless.com site, we've got a new report on this topic too. So please check that out as well. But again, thanks so much, Neela and Peter, for the time today. We appreciate it, and hopefully we'll talk again soon on the topic.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.